Let me ask you this about Big Pharma, and this is about vaccines. You say that the government regulators have been bought off by Big Pharma. I think that's what you're saying when you say that this entanglement has occurred. You said agency employees are actually getting royalties, getting payments on vaccines and drugs that they approve. Is that true?
Yes, there's a couple of things happening with FDA. About 50% of FDA's budget comes from regulated industries, so mainly the pharmaceutical industries. You have agency capture on steroids. The principal objective of FDA today is to serve the mercantile interests of pharmaceutical companies. And that's why you see FDA not only approving all of these drugs that shouldn't be approved, but they also are, out to destroy things that are actually shown to be good for you that do not make profits for the pharmaceutical companies. But then the agency I was talking about in the quote that you just cited is NIH. And in 1980, we passed a law called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Bayh-Dole Act, for the first time, allowed individual scientists and NIH as the agency to collect royalties on drugs on which they had done research. And it really transformed, that law transformed NIH. When I was growing up, NIH was only 15 minutes from my home. And my mother had a secretary who was married to a scientist who worked there. And I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid, so I went to NIH all the time to look at the rats and look through the microscopes, et cetera. It was the premier scientific agency in the world. All the other countries, nobody in the world had anything like that. And they would look to America for science, and particularly for medical research, biomedical research. Well, after the Bayh-Dole Act, NIH began slowly migrating from a scientific research agency to a drug development incubator. And I think in 2016, and I may get these numbers wrong, but I think that year there were about 220 new drugs approved by FDA, and 100% of them came out of NIH. For example, the Moderna vaccine, NIH owns half of that vaccine, 50%. So the billions of dollars that vaccine makes, half of that goes to NIH, the agency, but there's also individuals, at least 4, and maybe 6 individuals who work for NIH who are high-level deputies under Anthony Fauci who get to collect $150,000 a year forever, not just for their lives, but their children. As long as that mRNA technology is on the market, they're going to be making money from it.
Okay,
and that is a conflict.
Hang on a minute now, because I don't want to blow by this too fast. So the National Institute of Health is getting a kickback, a bribe, a royalty, a share, whatever you want to call it. Is this not a clear conflict of interest?
Yes.
That's what you're pointing out, right?
Yeah, it is. People are shocked.
Why are you the only one talking about this?
If you talk about this kind of thing, you get censored on YouTube. You will not be allowed on the mainstream media to talk about these issues. It used to be that you could, and nowadays you cannot.
If there's some rational reason for it, then why would they try to censor and hide it?
I think it was an idealistic reason. This was, 1980, right? It was the time of the Reagan Revolution. If you put privatized incentives into the government agencies, that they would function better and more efficiently.
Yeah, but it's always the right time to do the right thing. And by the way, they can't get emergency approval for these things if there's a treatment available, you've also pointed out.
The whole approval of the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccines during COVID required them to suppress any other therapeutic drugs that may have been effective against COVID. And a lot of people believe, including myself, that there were therapeutics that were very, very effective against COVID, like ivermectin, like hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, and many, many others, and that they were deliberately suppressed because the government wanted to issue these emergency use authorizations, and it would have been illegal if they acknowledged that there was an existing drug that was approved for any purpose that was effective against COVID.
it seems to me that that's another conflict of interest, that they have to suppress this to get their payday.
We had 16% of the COVID deaths in the United States, and we only have 4.2% of the world's population. So we literally did worse than any country in the world, at least by that data point. And I think one of the reasons was the systematic suppression of things that could have helped patients in hospitals all over the country and individuals who just got COVID. That everybody was directed toward down one path, and it was the path that was being dictated from above.
Biden referred to this at one point as, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Was he pushing these vaccinations for the wrong reasons? You probably know I took a very strong position about the mismanagement of this quarantine, about the mismanagement of this pandemic, about what it did to our young people. But they're pushing these vaccines on children who were not at high risk. This was not a lethal virus for them. They're pushing this on children. They're pushing it on pregnant mothers. And when there's a profit motive involved here, I spent a lot of my life trying to figure out why people do what they do and don't do what they don't do. Like, if somebody's selling me a car, if a mechanic's telling me this is sound, I want to know if he also owns the car, right? I mean, don't you want to know somebody's motives? And doesn't this call into question the motive? You're saying this should be transparent. We should know this if people are telling us this is what we should do. And oh, by the way, I make money every time you do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous and useful quote by Upton Sinclair: it's almost impossible to convince a man of a fact if the existence of that fact will diminish his salary. It's just common sense that we want to know, you want to eliminate conflicts of interest, so that particularly among government officials, so that you know that they're acting on behalf of the public welfare and they don't have a private stake in their decision.
Did you say the COVID vaccine was the deadliest vaccine ever approved?
Well, it was the deadliest in terms of how many deaths were reported to the VAERS database. Now, you don't know causation. I took the vaccine and the next day I had a heart attack or a stroke or myocarditis. You can't say for sure that that injury was attributable to that.
It was correlational, not causative,
right.
but it still occurs together.
When you see this huge uptick within, I think, the first year of the release of the COVID vaccine, there were more reports to COVID of deaths and injuries than all vaccines put together for the previous almost 36 years. So in that sense, yeah, it was the deadliest vaccine ever. And, you know, part of that is that it was mandated for so many people.
One of your key focus points is to unravel the corporate capture of government agencies and the corporate capture of health agencies. How do you achieve that?
Well, that's a good question. I think each agency you have to address on its, because they all have unique structures. Part of the problem is policy and structure, and part of it is personnel. If there are perverse incentives, like at FDA, where 50% of the budget comes from Pharma, or NIH, where regulators are getting paid to make sure that drugs get on the market. Congress actually had hearings on it. And Anthony Fauci testified at those hearings because he was making money on some of these, drugs that he had developed. So you have a scientist who is supposed to be looking for problems in that drug. That's what his job is as a regulator, find the problems to make sure you're protecting the public. But if he's paying for his mortgage and he's paying for his children's education, he's paying for his boat, he's paying for his alimony from that $150,000 a year, you could expect and you could predict that he's going to be less vigilant about finding problems. That's what we call a perverse incentive, and those needed to be undone. Because of the revolving door at the top of these agencies, the people who tend to get promoted are people who are willing to carry water for the industry. The regulators become sock puppets of the industry. And when people get to the end of their careers for a government agency, they go work for the industries they regulated. So right before they leave, they tend to do a lot of favors for those industries and their senior management And that example, that bad example, tends to percolate downward throughout their whole division.
And then they go across the street and work for who they were regulating.
Yeah. So when you do that, you can't drain the swamp. These are all swamp creatures. Mm-hmm. And it amplifies that corporate capture that we see, happening anyway at the lower level. But you can clean it out. And I understand the perverse incentives that need to be changed right away in order to change agency culture and get them doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is to be serving the public interest and protecting public health. We're now the unhealthiest country in the world. Yeah. We have the highest chronic disease burden in the world. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, almost 60% do. And nobody's doing anything about this. Nobody's talking about it. The autism rates in my generation, depending on which study, 1 in 2,500 or 1 in 10,000. In my kids' generation, it's 1 in every 34 kids, 1 in every 22 boys. So Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. EPA came back and said, it's a red line, 1989. And so something happened in 1989. We know this epidemic is not happening because of genes. Genes don't cause epidemics, as you know. You need an environmental toxin. So why are we looking for what toxin it was that hit every demographic, became ubiquitous in 1989? And those are the studies that I'm going to get them to do as president.